Sarah Kim Johnson eased her Tesla Model Y into a parallel parking spot a block away from EverTrust Bank's downtown branch. The morning sun caught the building's imposing glass facade, creating a gleaming beacon against the autumn sky. She checked her watch, 9:47 a.m. prime banking hours, when the morning rush had subsided but lunch hadn't yet begun. In her rearview mirror, she adjusted the collar of her vintage Diane von Furstenberg blazer, a cherished find from her thrifting days. The worn silk lining held memories of countless interviews, rejected loan applications, and doors slammed in her face. Now, 15 years later, she owned the very institutions that had once denied her entry. As she gathered her things, her phone buzzed with messages from the board about the upcoming quarterly meeting. Sarah smiled, remembering how those same board members had dismissed her initial purchase offer for EverTrust's parent company as ambitious. 3 years of strategic acquisitions and technological overhauls had transformed the once struggling bank into the region's fastest-growing financial institution. The check in her designer bag represented her latest triumph, $2.3 million from the acquisition of a promising fintech startup. She could have had her assistant deposit it or, better yet, handled it through electronic transfer. But these unannounced branch visits were her way of staying grounded, of remembering the young woman who once stood in line at banks like this, clutching a rejected loan application. Sarah pulled a compact mirror from her bag, noting the silver strands beginning to appear in her neat cornrows, earned through years of late nights and early mornings. Her mother had always told her that gray hair was a crown of wisdom, especially for a black woman in the banking industry. At 42, Sarah wore hers with pride. The street hummed with the usual downtown energy. A hot dog vendor was setting up his cart nearby, the smell of onions and peppers already wafting through the air. 2 young bankers hurried past, paper coffee cups in hand, too engrossed in their conversation about market futures to notice her. Sarah savored these moments of anonymity, rare since Forbes had featured her in their 40 Under 40 issue last spring. She stepped out of her car, her comfortable sneakers a deliberate choice, one of many small ways she pushed back against banking's stuffy traditions. The branch's security guard would be Angelo if the schedule hadn't changed. He'd been with EverTrust for 20 years and knew every regular customer by name, though he'd never met the bank's owner. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time, it was her daughter sending a photo of her college acceptance letter. Harvard Business School, her alma mater, the same institution where, 2 decades ago, a professor had advised her that commercial banking might be too ambitious for someone with her background. Now, she guest lectured there twice a year. Taking a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, Sarah felt the familiar mix of anticipation and purpose that these visits always brought. In her experience, real change didn't happen in boardrooms or through policy memos alone. It happened in branches like this one, in everyday interactions, in moments when preconceptions collided with reality. She squared her shoulders, checked that the check was secure in her bag, and began walking toward the bank's entrance. It was time to see how EverTrust's frontline employees treated their customers, especially those who didn't look like typical multimillionaires. Thomas Barrett stood in his usual morning spot, just left of the marble column that marked the center of EverTrust Bank's lobby. From here, he could survey his domain, the sleek counters, the software of counting machines, the orchestrated dance of tellers and customers that he had conducted for the past 3 weeks since his promotion to downtown branch manager. The glass doors whispered open, and Sarah Kim Johnson stepped inside. Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly, a reflexive response he had developed over 15 years of branch banking. Something about her seemed out of place. Perhaps it was the casual sneakers beneath her expensive blazer, or the way she moved through the space without the usual customer's hesitation. He watched as she bypassed the velvet rope-line dividers, walking directly to teller window 3, where Jenny Martinez, their newest hire, was organizing her drawer for the day. Barrett made a mental note to remind Sarah about proper queue protocol, already composing the speech in his head about respect for other customers' time. The morning light streaming through the tall windows caught the edge of something in Sarah's hand as she reached into her bag, a check. But the casual way she handled it suggested it wasn't a paycheck or standard business deposit. Barrett's fingers instinctively straightened his tie. a habit from his days as a junior loan officer in the suburbs, where he had built his reputation on spotting potential fraud. Jenny's expression shifted as she examined the check, her newly manicured fingers hovering over the keyboard. Barrett recognized the look, the slight widening of the eyes, the quick dart of uncertainty. He was already moving before Jenny's hand reached for the intercom button. "Is there something I can help with?" Barrett asked, his shoes clicking against the polished floor as he approached. He positioned himself slightly behind Jenny's shoulder, creating what he considered a subtle show of authority. The amount on the check made his throat tighten. $2.3 million. In his entire banking career, he'd never seen a personal deposit this large walking off the street. Sarah met his gaze with a calm that only unsettled him further. "I'm just making a deposit," she said, her voice carrying the kind of confidence that usually came with old money or corporate power. But Barrett had memorized the profiles of all major corporate clients in his first week. She wasn't one of them. "This is quite a substantial transaction," he said carefully, lifting the check from Jenny's counter. The paper felt authentic enough, but fraudsters were getting better every day. He noted the tech company's logo in the corner, the authorized signature that seemed too perfect. "We'll need to verify some additional information." Sarah nodded, reaching for her ID before he could ask. The casualness of her movement suggested she'd done this before. But something didn't add up. Barrett had built his career on these instincts, on spotting the microscopic tells that separated genuine transactions from elaborate scams. "Would you mind stepping over to my office?" he asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a question. As Sarah gathered her things, Barrett caught Jenny's eye and gave a subtle nod, their prearranged signal to alert security to be on standby. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows across the lobby floor as Sarah followed Barrett toward his office. Neither of them realized that these next few moments would reshape not just their lives, but the entire culture of EverTrust Bank. Barrett's fingers drummed an irregular rhythm on his desk as he examined the check for the third time. The morning light filtering through his office blinds cast thin stripes across the paper like prison bars. Sarah sat across from him, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert, watching his every move with the patience of a chess master anticipating an opponent's blunder. "So, Miss Johnson," he began, drawing out each syllable of her name as if testing its authenticity. "You're saying this check is from the acquisition of—" He paused, glancing down at the check again. "Techfin Solutions?" "That's correct," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had first unsettled him in the lobby. "The acquisition was finalized yesterday afternoon. We can call their CEO if you'd like verification." She reached for her phone, but Barrett raised his hand to stop her. "That won't be necessary. Just yet." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking slightly. "What interests me is why someone would bring such a substantial check to this particular branch, especially when wire transfers are the standard for transactions of this magnitude." Sarah's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something more knowing. "I believe in experiencing our services firsthand. Don't you think that's important, Mr. Barrett?" The question caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly. "Our services are designed to protect both the bank and our legitimate customers," he emphasized, the word legitimate ever so slightly pointed. He watched for a reaction that didn't come. Outside his office, the usual morning bustle of the bank continued, muffled by the thick glass walls. A young couple was meeting with a loan officer about their first mortgage. An elderly man carefully counted out bills for deposit, normal banking activities that made sense to Barrett, unlike the scene unfolding in his office. "The signature on this check," he continued, holding it up to the light, "seems unusually perfect. Almost too perfect." His wedding ring tapped against the desk as he set the check down, a nervous tick he'd never managed to eliminate. Sarah uncrossed and recrossed her legs, her expensive silk pants rustling softly. "I assure you, everything is in order. Would you like to see additional identification? Perhaps my business cards?" Her hand moved toward her bag. "Miss Johnson, if that is your name," Barrett interjected, his patience wearing thin. "In my 15 years of banking experience, I've learned that those intent on committing fraud often come prepared with elaborate documentation." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Not fear or guilt, as Barrett expected, but something that looked remarkably like pity. She reached into her bag again, slower this time, maintaining eye contact. Barrett's finger hovered over the silent alarm button beneath his desk. I should warn you that attempting to pass fraudulent checks of this size is a federal offense, one that could result in significant jail time. Mr. Barrett. Sarah spoke his name with deliberate care. Before you make any calls or press any buttons, I suggest you take one more look at the watermark on that check. Really look at it. Do you recognize the signature style? He glanced down again, studying the watermark more closely. Something about it seemed familiar, the same design he saw every morning on his own business cards. The EverTrust logo he'd admired since his first day with the bank. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background as realization began to creep into the edges of Barrett's consciousness. Like dawn breaking over a dark horizon, the grandfather clock in Barrett's office ticked away the seconds of his growing certainty. He'd caught a fraudster, perhaps the biggest one in his career. The digital clock on his desk read 10:17 a.m., and he knew the local police precinct was just 3 blocks away. His office, normally a sanctuary of control and order, felt different today. The walls, lined with his achievements, his MBA diploma, customer service awards, and a photo of him shaking hands with the previous regional director, all seemed to watch the scene unfold. Ms. Johnson, Barrett said, straightening the check on his desk with mathematical precision. I've contacted our fraud department and security team. They're on their way. A lie, but one he'd found useful in the past to observe reactions. Sarah adjusted her position in the leather chair, not in discomfort, but as if preparing for a lengthy discussion. That's interesting, she replied, her voice carrying no trace of concern. Because I believe Gloria Thompson heads our fraud department, and she's currently at her daughter's college graduation in Boston. Barrett's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second. The detail was correct. He'd received the departmental memo about Thompson's absence last week. He recovered quickly, reaching for his desk phone. Nevertheless, this situation requires immediate attention. I'm going to contact local law enforcement. Before you do that, Sarah said, reaching into her bag once more, I should probably mention that I'm having lunch with Police Chief Martinez this afternoon. We serve on the city's Financial Inclusion Board together. She placed her phone on his desk, screen up, showing the calendar invite that confirmed her words. The air in the office grew thicker. Barrett's collar felt tight, but he refused to show any sign of doubt. He'd built his career on protecting the bank from people trying to game the system. The fact that this woman knew names and details only made her more suspicious in his eyes. You seem to have an answer for everything, he said, his tone hardening. But that doesn't change the fact that you're attempting to deposit a check that's larger than our branch's monthly transaction volume. A check that, frankly, doesn't align with your... He paused, choosing his next words carefully. Apparent circumstances? Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. My apparent circumstances? Please, Mr. Barrett, elaborate on what circumstances you believe I should appear to have. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Barrett glanced at the security camera in the corner of his office, its red light blinking steadily. He'd review this footage later, he thought, to document her behavior for the police report. Let's be direct, he said, folding his hands on his desk. A check of this magnitude would typically come through our corporate banking division. The fact that you're attempting to deposit it in person, dressed as you are, suggests either a lack of understanding of banking protocols or something more nefarious. Sarah leaned forward slightly, her expression unchanged. Mr. Barrett, in my experience, assumptions are expensive things. Some might even say they're luxuries that neither banks nor their managers can afford. The subtle emphasis she placed on the word managers made Barrett's spine stiffen. He reached for his phone again, this time with more determination. I've heard enough. I'm calling security, and then we'll let the police sort this out. As his finger moved to dial, Sarah reached for her own phone with a deliberate slowness that made Barrett pause. That won't be necessary, she said, her voice taking on a new tone of authority. But since you're so concerned about protocol, let's contact someone who can verify my identity. I suggest we start with Regional Director Phillips. Sarah's fingers moved across her phone screen with practiced ease, each tap echoing in the suddenly quiet office. Barrett watched, his hand still hovering over his own phone, as she pressed the speaker button. The dial tone filled the room, each ring stretching time like taffy, until a familiar voice answered. Regional Director Phillips speaking. Came the crisp response. "James, it's Sarah Kim Johnson," she said, her eyes locked on Barrett's increasingly uncertain face. "I'm at the downtown branch with Mr. Barrett. We seem to have a situation regarding check verification." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but felt like hours to Barrett. Then came Phillips's response, his voice transformed by recognition and something that sounded remarkably like fear. "Madam Chairwoman, I wasn't aware you were visiting branches today." The title hit Barrett like a physical blow. His hand dropped from his phone as the blood drained from his face, leaving him pale under the office's fluorescent lights. The family photos on his desk seemed to turn away in embarrassment. "Yes, I'm conducting one of my regular branch visits," Sarah continued, her voice taking on an edge of authority that Barrett now realized had always been there. "Mr. Barrett was just explaining the bank's policy on large deposits. In fact, he was about to call security regarding my attempted deposit of a $2.3 million check." Phillips's sharp intake of breath was audible through the speaker. "Mr. Barrett," he said, his voice strained, "you are speaking with Sarah Kim Johnson, majority owner and chairwoman of Evertrust's parent company. She's your boss's boss's boss." Barrett's world tilted on its axis. The awards on his wall, the carefully curated symbols of his banking expertise, seemed to mock him now. His mind raced through every word he'd spoken in the past 30 minutes, each assumption and insinuation coming back to haunt him with crystal clarity. "I find these unannounced visits invaluable," Sarah continued, addressing both men. "They provide unique insights into how our branches actually operate." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "James, I'll need a full report on branch operations and customer service protocols on my desk by tomorrow morning." "Of course, Madam Chairwoman. Right away," Phillips responded, his usual confidence replaced by eager compliance. Barrett's chair creaked as he shifted, sweat forming on his brow despite the cool air conditioning. The same check he had scrutinized for fraud now seemed to glow with legitimacy on his desk, its watermark the very symbol of the institution he served, a testament to his monumental error. "Thank you, James," Sarah said, ending the call. The office plunged into a silence broken only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and Barrett's shallow breathing. She reached across the desk and retrieved her check, sliding it into her designer bag with the same casual confidence she had shown when first entering the bank. Standing up, she smoothed her silk pants and regarded Barrett with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Barrett," she said, her voice level but carrying the weight of authority he should have recognized from the beginning. "I believe we should continue this conversation. But first, I'd like you to walk with me through the branch. I'm curious to see how other customers are being treated this morning."